The last section of chapter 15 is called Changing Attitudes, and it deals with social behavior, literature, and art set during the age of religious wars. And it reflects some of the tensions of the age and the feelings of insecurity and anxiety that people had as these massive battles are being fought all around them. So here's the thesis. The cultural consequences of the religious wars bred confusion, uncertainty, and insecurity. It's an era of extreme and violent contrast, and also an age of hypocrisy, where people say one thing but do another. So, for example, these folks in the 15th and 16th centuries were deeply religious, and yet you're going to see the beginning of this movement called skepticism in literature. They wanted to Christianize the native peoples of the New Worlds that we learned about last time, and yet they proceeded to dominate and enslave them. People expressed views of knowledge and exploration and wanting to learn and move forward, and yet there was a belief in witches, as we'll see. And sexism, racism, and skepticism began to take on very modern forms. So in that sense, there's a lot in here that we can relate to. The status of women. So, in the age of religious wars, really this is the 1500s and moving into the 1600s. Very traditional roles for men and women still. The husband is the provider, the protector of the family. He makes the money. He's not supposed to be a tyrant, but he's supposed to lead and rule. This is very traditional, going back 1,000 years. Romance and physical attraction was not considered a good basis for a relationship. Economics. Being able to get along and make money together and have a good, solid foundation. That's what matters, not romance, not physical attraction. That's much later. Marriage is about improving your economic or your social position. You need to find a good wife that's a worker. And if you're a woman, you need to find a man that's a good worker. It's going to take care of you. That's what you need. The role of the wife is domestic. Household duties. No public role, no political role. In that sense, there's very little change from the Renaissance. There's some differences in the way these two new denominations viewed marriage, though. Here's something different. See, Catholics, marriage is a sacrament. It's one of those things you do to earn God's grace, and you can't break it. There's no divorce allowed in the Catholic Church. Marriage is holy, and once you're in it, you cannot get out. That's just the way it is. It's permanent. Whereas Protestants immediately had a different view of this situation. They saw marriage as more of a contract that you entered into willingly. And so they allowed divorce in case of things like adultery and abandonment, and they had to have reasons, but you could get out of a bad marriage in Protestant territories in Europe. The point here is that this is still a very patriarchal society where men lead and men rule, as opposed to a matriarchal society where it would be the other way around. It's a patriarchal, means man-centered society. And maybe that's reinforced by the standards of beauty that you'll see in Baroque art at the end of this section, where artists and the generation really did portray women as beautiful and fat. They wanted very plump women. That was the standard of beauty. And so you could see that's maybe the beginning of some sexism in art. That's a theory that people have. One last change in the status of women, or maybe continuation from the Reformation, is that the convents were closed and thousands of women were out of a job all of a sudden. That used to be full-time nuns. Now they're out. They're out and they can't work in the marketplace or in business. And so for upper-class women particularly, the only available occupation was now to get married, marriage. And so some historians think that the closing of the convents was a setback for women, because in convents women could pursue literature and reading and be scholarly and study the Bible and read text and all that. But once those are gone, and at least in England and in the German states where the Reformation really took place, that was no longer the case. You were going to become wives. The Great European Witch Hunt. This is another thing that affects mainly women, actually. One of the more unusual parts of European history is in the age of religious wars, there's massive belief in witches and witch hunts. And it's very widespread. Very, very educated people believed in witches at this point. Chief justices of the English Supreme Courts believed in witches, all the way down to commoners, okay? It's not just something that folk people believed in, but everybody believed in this. And it was very widespread. And why did people believe in witches? A lot of people think it was the insecurity of the religious wars and all the uncertainty of all that around them maybe contributed to this belief. I'll read you some things from our textbook here about witchcraft. A witch, according to the Chief Justice of England, was a person who hath conference with the devil. to consult with him, or to do some act of the devil. This was the highest legal authority in England saying this, by the way. Witches were thought to be individuals who could mysteriously injure other people or animals by causing a person to become blind or impotent, or preventing something like a cow from giving milk. Tales circulated, as you might notice in this picture, for centuries about old women who made nocturnal travels on greased broomsticks to assemblies of other witches where they participated in sexual orgies and feasted on the flesh of infants. Wow. The majority of people suspected of witchcraft were married women or widows between 50 and 70 years old, crippled or bent with age, with pockmarked skin. They often practiced midwifery, they were midwives, or folk medicine, and most had sharp tongues and were quick to scold, meaning they were mean. They were mean old women in the community. This is what people thought, who they thought were witches. How many people were accused or killed of witchcraft? A lot. In southwestern Germany, 3,000 witches were executed between 1560 and 1670. In Switzerland, almost 9,000 people were tried as witches between 1470 and 1700, and 5,000 of them were killed for it. Incredible numbers here. In England, between 1550 and 1730, 1,000 witches, suspected witches, were executed in England, probably the most advanced country at that time. So it's just a widespread belief here. Lots of stuff. So why do people believe in witches? Again, here's some reasons, 3 of them. 1, it accounts for misfortunes in society. You blame someone for things that you don't like, okay? 2, it attacks nonconformists, particularly female nonconformists that don't go along with traditional gender roles. 3, people did believe that other people were believing that people believed that there was devil worship among them, and they hunted out the weak members of society that they thought were doing that, women. Lastly, maybe it was a way to attack women who had strange behavior. That's similar to what we already said here. And this is it's all an example of misogyny. That word you got to know. MISOGYNY. The issues and the discrimination faced by women in history, misogyny. All right, how does it all come to an end? The Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, which is going to happen in around 1750. Finally, people stop believing in witches and stop trying them and killing them. But it goes on for a long time, all right? Just know that. It doesn't stop till about 1750. Okay, let's move on. We'll do more about witchcraft in class when we study that. All right, Section D, European slavery and origins of racism. All right, so now we switch totally to a different topic happening in the Age of Religious Wars. The slave trade takes on a much more intense focus. The Ottoman capture of Constantinople in 1453 had sort of shut off the eastern Mediterranean from the Europeans, and it stopped the flow of white slaves, which had always come from the east. Slave means Slav, from Slavic territories in Eastern Europe. So now Europeans turn to black slavery from Africa as a replacement. Slavery is always tied up with the history of sugar and the demand for labor that goes into sugar plantations, particularly in the Central America and Caribbean region. So sugar is always tied in with slavery. The Age of Exploration created a huge shortage of labor as a lot of Native American people were killed through disease. There was a new demand for slaves from Africa to replace them. The first groups to be enslaved in the New World were Indians, or native peoples, Indians, and they died in mass numbers. They were very susceptible to disease, and they didn't have very high survival rates when the Spanish and Portuguese got there. A very famous Spaniard named Bartholomew de las Casas in 1518 decided that what Europeans needed now was black slavery because Native Americans weren't fit for it. So he's gonna call for the opening up of the African slave trade. And really, Charles V is who began it for Spain. That Charles V, he was everywhere, doing everything in European history. He's very important, involved in so many stories here. The extent of slavery is massive. It's sponsored by the governments of Portugal, the Netherlands, and England. Everyone had their own slave trade companies. This slave trade goes most heavily from 1550 to 1700. Look at this map. This is the routes, the slave routes, all over from Africa to South America, particularly into the Caribbean, and then to a lesser extent in this generation, the U.S. Of course, that's going to get bigger later in history. And the numbers there, the number of slaves, 8 million, it's hard to see. The thick arrows are 8 million, the skinnier arrows are 4 million, and all the way down to 1 million. The width of the route indicates the number of people transported. Just one of the darkest periods, of course, in world history. Let's finish up with literature and art. Skepticism. This is what's happening in literature in the age of religious wars. It's doubt, doubting total certainty or definitive knowledge. And this is a new philosophy of life and literature that emerges. Prior to this, everyone was certain that Christianity was the only truth. The Catholics had the answers as the only church in the business. And so now all of a sudden there's all these different religious groups, Protestants, Catholics, many denominations. And there's some people express an anxiety that maybe, are any of them the right way? Are any of them the truth anymore? So there's a definite connection to the religious wars that you have to be able to make with skepticism. The most famous skeptic is Michel de Montaigne, a Frenchman, who was a noble, actually was a noble of the robe. His family had bought a title of nobility from the Valois dynasty. He made a good living as a noble of the robe, and he retired at 38 years old to live on a manor, a farm, and he lived the rest of his life in contemplation as a scholar writing from his home, and he had deep thoughts. You can read a lot more about Michel de Montaigne if you'd like. There's a whole section about him in your textbook. He was a good humanist. His teachings included being calm. His principles are to be calm and patient, and have tolerance, open-mindedness, detachment, independence. He rejected religious extremism, what we would call religious dogma, and he lived a life of research where he studied things. This was his whole thing. Michel de Montaigne, very interesting guy, all right? His main idea is to know yourself, know thyself. Self-knowledge teaches us how to live in accordance with nature and with God. So don't think he was an atheist, but he was distant from religious extremism, but not an atheist. He invented the essay, which is to test something, to express your thoughts and ideas on a topic. Okay? Michel de Montaigne, really interesting guy. He wrote essays on lots of subjects. He wrote an essay on cannibalism, in which he said, let's not be too quick to judge these natives in the New World who practice cannibalism, because we're just judging them by our own standards and not their own. So it's an interesting guy. He said, wonder is the foundation of all philosophy, research is the means of all learning, and ignorance is the end of everything. So there's a good quote by Michel de Montaigne. All right, Elizabethan and Jacobean literature. This is up in England now, not France. This is what's happening in England during the time of Elizabeth and James I. James I of England. We'll learn more about him later. They produce literature, incredible literature. This is actually known as the Elizabethan Renaissance, Queen Elizabeth. The Renaissance in England takes the form of literature, particularly of Shakespeare. All right, William Shakespeare, of course, the most probably famous writer of all time. His father was a glove maker. Okay, not anything special. And of course, he's a Renaissance man. Shakespeare is our biggest Renaissance man of all. Read about Shakespeare. Read a biography on Wikipedia or something. Look him up and read a bit about his early life. Fascinating guy. What are the topics and themes of his plays? The human condition, human psychology, stories of the past, classical stories. So he's a humanist. So Roman and Greek stories. Okay, like Julius Caesar is a play of Shakespeare. And these are great classical themed plays. English history is another theme. So he writes like Hamlet. That's not an English story, that's a Danish story. But he writes stories of monarchs and kings. He writes Henry V, set in the 100 Years' War. So he's a patriot. He writes the story of England in play form. He's a nationalist. Of course, tragedies are another theme and topic of Shakespeare's plays, like Romeo and Juliet. Tragedies that involve pride or revenge or sin, some fatal flaw in the main character takes him down at the end. So why do we love Shakespeare so much? We see ourselves in him, in his work, right? When was the last time you read a piece of Shakespeare? Hopefully in high school you have. I read a bunch in high school. I read Hamlet and Macbeth and Julius Caesar and Romeo and Juliet, and they're wonderful plays. You see yourself in them. You see the nature of man that doesn't change. Technology changes, but the nature of man does not, and that's why Shakespeare lives on. That's why people still go see his plays all over the world today, because they're so relevant. They still matter. Here's his theater in London, the Globe Theater, the Globe Playhouse that he had designed and constructed just for his plays. So they would be, put on in a great forum. The cheap seats were right in the front. You stood right in that section of there's the Globe Theater as it looks today. They've rebuilt it actually in London. You can see plays in it today. But this is it. The cheap seats are right, the standing only seats, and the expensive seats are up in those boxes right there. Those were just like they were in Shakespeare time, where all the rich people want a box seat, just like in a stadium today. All right. Another work of literature done in the Elizabethan and Jacobean era was a new translation of the Bible, the King James Bible, authorized by King James himself in England. It's a work of literature. Of course, it's the Bible, but because it's in English, it's one of the first books in contemporary English of the day. It's vernacular literature, and it establishes phrases and the use of the English language that really sets a precedent. It's kind of like when Luther translated the Bible into German, right? This is the same kind of thing. It establishes idioms and phrases that matter and go on. So who wanted this most of all? The Puritans, the Calvinists up in England wanted a new Protestant interpretation of the Bible. And they were sick of the Catholic Bible in Latin. They wanted this as a sign of their faith. They wanted a new English Bible. It was produced under royal sponsorship of the King of England, who actually did this as a way to pacify the angry Puritans. King James was no Puritan. He was an Anglican. And as we'll see in the next chapter, he's actually almost a Catholic-leaning guy. He actually had sympathies for Catholics. He did this to get them to shut up because they were so angry about wanting this. It was to placate them. It encourages these lay people, these non-clergymen, to read the Bible in their own language. And of course, this King James Bible is the #1 best-selling book of all time, actually, if you didn't know that. And it goes all over to North America, into the new colonies there. It's just an incredible piece of literature in and of itself. There's poetry, of course, in the Bible. There's story. There's verse. As a work of literature, there's nothing quite like it. And again, it's the #1 bestseller of all time. It has a profound influence on Christians all the world over, which of course is still the #1 religion at this point in history, is some form of Christianity. All right, lastly, but not least, Baroque art. We're going to study this extensively in class. Just give you some highlights here. Baroque art is the period of art history during the Age of Religious Wars, primarily from about 1550 to about 1700. That's the age of the Baroque. The word comes from a definition, means an irregularly shaped pearl. Irregularly shaped pearl. And at first it was kind of a criticism, and then it sticks and we like it. So here's the characteristics of Baroque art. Dramatic, overwhelming, emotional, exuberant, theatrical. Baroque art is about your heart and your senses, appealing to you, your senses, your heart, okay? And it's set during the age of the religious wars. The Counter-Reformation is a big part of this. The Catholic Church uses Baroque art as a tool to win people back, to touch them emotionally and speak to your faith. But it's mainly Catholic, but it's more than Catholic. Protestant nations use Baroque art and get on board too, particularly in the German states with Bach, the composer Bach. Music takes on a Baroque form in Protestant countries, but there's mainly Catholic paintings of Baroque art and sculpture and architecture. We'll see that. It's a tool of the Counter-Reformation to win you back. See, Renaissance art appeals to your head, your logic, your rationality, right? Everything is symmetrical and perfect and classical. Baroque art appeals to your heart and your feeling and your emotions. You got to know the difference. All right, so there's Rubens as an example. Peter Paul Rubens. They look at this scene. There's angels flying around. There's people with weapons. There's people praying. It's like on stage. Baroque art is almost on stage. And we'll look at lots more of this in class. Music, Baroque music. Who dominates? Vivaldi down in the Italian states. Antonio Vivaldi writes the Four Seasons, depicting, of course, winter, spring, summer, and fall. Johann Sebastian Bach is a German in the German states. His music has incredible religious themes, and also some secular too. But it's the themes of the music are invention, tension, and emotion. Lots of organ music. I'll play you some of this in class, of course. Anyway, very emotionally powerful music and religious music primarily to, again, connect to that Catholic Counter-Reformation. There's also a Northern Baroque movement called the Dutch Golden Age or the Dutch Baroque, and they have some of the same techniques, although not as religious, and we'll get all that in class, so stay tuned for more Baroque art.